Well, while we will continue our review of some of the developments that played out in 2013 as the year winds down. Dr. Dapo Thomas joins us today. He's a lecturer in international relations in Lagos State University. Well, he's a Foreign Affairs Analyst. Thank you for coming on this morning, sir. Well, looking at our foreign relations, we know that so many matters, so many events played out in 2013 that we had cause to ask, look, what is even the focus, or what is our foreign policy? We do know that it's Afrocentric, and we heard a lot of people say, look, the fundamental principles of our foreign policy remains consistent ever since the independence, but some of the priorities change as governments come in, they focus on certain aspects, bring up to speed. What do we even need to change our foreign policy from being Afrocentric?
Well, let me explain that it's unfortunate that the way we look at foreign policy, or the way we manage our foreign policy in Nigeria has been very lackadaisical in terms of the response. In terms of our response to challenges or dynamics of the international system. In the first instance, what necessitated the formulation of those principles, the 5 principles that form the framework of Nigeria's foreign policy, when you talk of respect for the sovereignty of other nations, when you talk of non-alignment, when you talk of multilateral diplomacy, when you talk of decolonization, when you talk of non-interference in the affairs of other nations.
They have international cooperation.
Well, it's part of multilateral diplomacy.
Okay.
But the fundamental 5 principles, are woven around those elements. Now, the issue is now that along the line, when those things were necessary, when those principles were very fundamental and key to developments in Africa, particularly the colonization and the liberation of South Africa, they had some meaning. When there was Cold War, decolonization had meaning when, as a result of the fact that most African nations, or some African nations, were still talking about independence, and then we still had apartheid in South Africa. Then we had that non-alignment necessitated as a result of the divide, the bipolar system between that's the Cold War. So one would expect that after, so we have 3 that will still be germane, contemporarily.
Okay.
And that's the respect for the sovereignty of other nations, multilateral diplomacy, and then possibly non-interference. And even the non-interference, still has some key legs. So I don't know what we are still doing with those 2 principles, non-alignment and decolonization. Because when you're talking of non-alignment, you should know that whether you want to agree that what we have now is the evolution of unipolarity or just dominance of United States, what has been our reaction, what has been our response to this development? That is the unipolar system. How have we been able to react? Our reaction has been conservative to the point that we still believe as process as usual. Process as usual meaning we relate to US still on the basis that we had a Western-oriented or Western-centric foreign policy. From Britain we moved to US, and that kind of. So it's a continuum. But no, we need to react to the ideological. To the present evolutionary system. To the contemporary system, which is the unipolar system. Our reaction is not now to US. That one is at the level of bilateral relations. But how do we react to unipolarity? You are reacting to a system. So our failure to react positively to that system is as a result of the fact that our foreign policy is not system driven. It's always individual driven. It's personality driven.
System driven. In fact, the fact that it's spelled out. How do you mean not
system driven? In the sense that, you see, if your policy is system driven, it reacts naturally to whatever changes occur in the system, in the international system. But because it is individuals, whether at the level of foreign policy making, or whether at the level of policy making, or at the level of political leadership, those are the people who determine, who dictate the pace, the direction of our foreign policy. So it's not system driven. If a new president comes now, it changes. Why? Because it's responding or reacting as per his own orientation or perception of what foreign policy should be.
Not based on
it's
the
not
document that we
have. Not based on the documents, or not based on what should be. What should be.
Does it, the thing now, let's break it down.
Yeah.
Does it really exist? Do we have a foreign policy? Because for some, because now you brought the non-alignment, you brought the bilateral ones, and we also brought the Afrocentric when we're looking at Africa as a center of our own foreign policy. But it looks to a lot of Nigerians that all of that has actually fizzled out to the extent that now we really can't lay our hands on a particular one and say this is our policy. Perhaps that is why some Nigerians outside the country are not too happy with the way the government handles its affairs outside the country.
I agree with you that the perception now, to people, is that we don't have foreign policy, but academically we do have. Academically, that's theoretically we have, but practically we don't have, because it's at the dictate of who is at the helm of affairs. Now, this Afrocentric thing you're talking about, that is Africa as the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign policy, made some sense maybe in the 60s, 70s, possibly maybe 80s. But, contemporarily, it doesn't make any sense to me again. Why? Because when Obasanjo came, he decided to now dilute the Afrocentric perspective, the perspective of foreign policy. How? He says, okay, politically, Nigeria is still reacting to the Afrocentric policy. That is, Africa still remains. But economically, we are now looking at the global order. You understand? So we now have economic dimension and political dimension to our Afrocentric outlook or character. So it depends. But ordinarily, it can change. It can change in the sense that, look, what are the things, what are the imperatives? What are the imperatives that are confronting the African state or the African continent now that Nigeria should react to? These are the things that our policymakers ought to have evolved. Because it's very funny that since 1991, where we can talk of the end of the Cold War, we still retain non-alignment as a principle in Nigeria's foreign policy. Since the independence or liberation of South Africa, possibly 1992-93, we are still talking of decolonization. We are still talking of liberation in Nigeria's foreign policy elements. So these are things that are dated.
How can we